Welcome to World Gone Weird, discussing what the heck is going on in the world today. It's, uh, been a couple of days, hasn't it?
Yeah, feels like a month. Honestly, I'm trying to keep up, but it's like every time I check my phone, there's a new executive order or something. It's wild.
I know, and it's not just the sheer volume of things happening, it's the implications, you know? Like, how does anyone even process this much change so quickly? My head's spinning.
Tell me about it. I feel like I need a spreadsheet just to keep track of what's going on. And it's not just big political stuff either, like even the weather. Are you kidding me? Blizzard on the Gulf Coast? What is that even about?
Right? I mean, the Gulf Coast being buried in snow, it's like a bizarre movie plot. And then you've got the pardons happening, and this stuff with AI, and I'm like, where do we even begin?
Well, let's start with the weather since that's, impacting people right now. I mean, Florida getting record snowfall, New Orleans getting slammed. All of it is just, it's hard to even believe. I was reading about how they're even having issues with emergency services getting through, that the roads are just completely iced over. And it just highlights how vulnerable our infrastructure is when these things hit, and how quickly things can go from normal to complete chaos.
Yeah, and it's not just physical infrastructure, it's like our cognitive infrastructure too, right? When people's routines and expectations are so completely upended, it can trigger a huge stress response. People are dealing with uncertainty, fear, possibly even loss. It impacts decision making and how they're processing the information about it. It's a cognitive overload.
Definitely. I was thinking about that, the stress. Like if you're already dealing with work or family, and then you add a once in a lifetime snowstorm on top of that, that's a lot for the body and mind. I wonder how many people are struggling with sleep right now, with the roads closed and stress levels high. I bet a lot of people aren't getting the rest they need.
Yeah, it's that lack of control feeling too, I'd think. Like you can't control the weather, and the suddenness makes it hard to adapt. I was reading some stuff on breathing techniques earlier. I was thinking, how could someone use that to manage stress when they're, say, stuck in a car in the middle of a blizzard? Like maybe a slow box breathing technique to help regulate their system, just as a method of self regulation.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's all about finding those tools when you're feeling powerless. It's like we can't control the weather, but we can control the weather, but we can control, or at least manage our reactions to it. And it's not just the weather. Look at these executive orders, right? People are having their whole worlds upended. And what I find interesting, if there's a silver lining in it, is that resourcefulness often arises from situations like that. People are going to find ways to survive. They'll innovate. They'll adjust. I think there is something fundamentally resilient about that. There was this one historical example, USS O'Bannon using potatoes as makeshift grenades. It sounds silly, but it's that mindset of how do we make it work?
That's fascinating. It's like a physical manifestation of cognitive flexibility, and it reminds me of CBT. We tend to have these automatic negative thoughts when things go wrong, but if we can consciously reframe those thoughts, we can change our emotional response and, in turn, our behavior. If someone's stranded, instead of thinking, I'm doomed, maybe they can think, okay, what resources do I have available right now? Even if it's just what's in their car or truck. That's problem solving at a fundamental level. It's about creating a new cognitive narrative.
Yeah, and I was thinking that whole mindset, it's applicable to everything, even something like exercise, right? If your normal gym is closed because of the snow, or you're too stressed to stick to a routine, you have to find new ways to move. You can't be rigid, you have to adapt. It makes me think about how we talked before about sleep. Even in these chaotic situations, getting enough sleep can help with stress and energy levels and be able to react more effectively to situations like this. And that ties back to these breathing techniques and mental exercises. It's a feedback loop.
Exactly. It's like if you can't do your usual workout, maybe you find a way to do bodyweight exercises at home or go for a walk outside, even if it's just a short one, in the cold. I know it's difficult, but it will help to re-energize the body in these extreme situations. And with the breathing work, I was just wondering, with something like a box breath or even a meditation focusing on the breath, I bet that even just 510 minutes of that could make a massive difference in someone's stress levels in a high stress situation.
That makes me think about how, sometimes the biggest limitations aren't external, they're internal. The idea that, say, Trump putting a 10% tariff on Chinese goods or a 25% tariff on Mexican and Canadian goods, and this affecting prices here, it can trigger a sense of panic, like, oh, what if everything is unaffordable? And if you're stuck in the snow, you can think, oh my God, I'm going to die out here, when maybe it's just an inconvenience, though obviously it's a dangerous one. It's that cognitive bias that makes it hard to find alternative solutions, or even just to cope. Like when the fast food chain White Castle opened, it was a big societal shift. It created something new. It was quick and affordable and convenient. It was a solution. But even small shifts in pricing or lifestyle can be hard to deal with when it becomes all-consuming.
Yes, and that's a perfect example of how cognitive biases influence our perception of reality. People might catastrophize about prices rising because of the tariffs, feeling like they're losing control. That's a classic cognitive distortion. CBT can help people recognize and challenge those thought patterns. Instead of saying, everything is going to be unaffordable, you could ask yourself, what affordable alternatives are there? Or, can I adjust my spending habits? It's about finding a sense of agency even when external factors are in flux.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like when you have that sleep debt we've talked about before. If you're so focused on the fact that you're not getting enough sleep, you get even more stressed, which of course makes it even harder to sleep. You can get trapped in that negative loop, and just like with the tariffs, if you just think, oh, it's too expensive now, you may not even try to find the options. It's that rigid thinking that makes things worse, not the situation itself.
It's that idea that, we sometimes make things harder for ourselves with our own mental responses. I mean, we have this amazing capacity to adapt if we can get out of our own way. Thinking about that and about, the bonobos, it was fascinating to learn that their vocal communication changes and grows over time. It seems that their vocalizations shift to accommodate new information and to meet new needs. It reminds me that even our mental and emotional responses are capable of growth if we allow them to be.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think that kind of adaptability is key right now. It's like how the Wright brothers used coffee to fuel their problem solving, It sounds simple, but that little boost helped them work through complex issues and innovate. Like right now, we need to be innovating and flexible, both on an individual level and a societal level. But then, thinking of that example, I wonder if these habits and how we use coffee can reflect patterns in our lives. Maybe those subtle patterns are there if we listen close enough.
That's a really interesting point. The connection between vocalizations, cognitive processes, and those daily routines. It opens up the question of, could we actually use those communication patterns as a form of biofeedback if we could just understand them properly? It could be a new way to develop targeted cognitive therapies. It might even be a way to identify stress before it becomes overwhelming. And perhaps the subtleties of communication could lead to new methods for cognitive restructuring, as those patterns could give us insight into the mind's workings and help us in turn work on restructuring the mind.
That's so intriguing. I mean, if those subtle shifts in vocalizations are tied to things like physical activity or sleep cycles, it could be a way to really tune into our bodies and how they're doing. It's like maybe there's a way to use that as a biofeedback tool during exercise, to gauge exertion, or to optimize our sleep. Like if there is a certain vocal pattern while bonobos are working out, maybe that pattern in us would mean time to stop or time to push harder. And it goes back to everything, right? If our sleep is tied to everything, and that can be revealed in even subtle vocal patterns, it seems like it would be worth studying.
It's like our voice, the way we use sound. It's almost like a living, breathing, constantly updating instrument of our inner states. Thinking about that idea and tying it into mindfulness, could we use the complexity of their communication, those subtle shifts, to access deeper states of awareness during meditation? Maybe their unique sounds could help us break through, mental chatter. I am really curious how we can tie those new scientific understandings into our own self-improvement efforts. It really reinforces to me that there is such a deep interconnectedness that we could be exploring more.
Yeah, and maybe it's that interconnectedness that's the biggest takeaway. It's not just about one thing or the other. It's about how everything affects everything else. Like the political stuff with Trump, his pardons, the executive actions. It's not isolated from the blizzard or from how people are dealing with the economy. Or this huge AI infrastructure project. These big actions have real impact on people's mental and physical health, and vice versa. It's all an ecosystem.
Absolutely, and even the January 6th pardons, it's not just about those individuals. The message it sends, the emotions it triggers, it all impacts the mental state of people who are struggling with a sense of justice and fairness that can manifest itself in a stress response. So it really goes back to understanding those cognitive biases and creating a new way of processing events. Instead of spiraling into anger or helplessness, can we use that knowledge of the mind to look for new ways forward?
Yeah, it's the cumulative effect. I think you're right, that these small practices, these breathing exercises, the mindfulness, that's the long-term resilience building, not these big singular actions. Because all these big actions, while they matter on a large scale, they don't change our immediate reactions as much. What we can control is how we respond, how we cope, how we adapt on a day-to-day basis. And all that, combined with some of these mindfulness practices, is where the real change occurs.
That is a really good point. Cognitive biases aren't just individual quirks. They play out on a societal level, especially during times of scarcity and change. The fear of lack triggers a very specific set of cognitive and emotional responses. We tend to focus more on potential losses than potential gains, and that heightened sense of scarcity can make people less rational, more emotional, and more prone to reactive behavior, like hoarding or panic. And it goes back to that idea that a more proactive mental strategy could be employed in those situations.
Yeah, and thinking about this whole thing, maybe there's a way to use the mind-body connection better. The way your mind reacts to the stress and how that manifests in your body. When I am working out, I am actively using that connection. If we listen to what our body is saying, it can help us with stress management and sleep, and that ties back to breathing and meditation. It's all tied together, these different aspects of life. We can't separate the political from the physical and mental.
Right? It's all so interconnected. The political stuff, with the pardons for the January 6th rioters, it sparks feelings of injustice, and it is important to acknowledge that. At the same time, we should also work on building that inner resilience. To me, it really speaks to the idea of collective responsibility. It's not just about individual actions, but about how we create a healthier and more ethical society. A society where we can, on our own level, build habits to cope with these massive external forces.
And it all circles back to how our cognitive processes can amplify or mitigate those conflicts. Our biases, our fears, they all play a huge role in how we react. This makes me think about how we could use that bonobo vocalization information. Perhaps their patterns can give us insights into how our own cognitive patterns develop. It's like studying the ways they communicate to reveal patterns that we can use to restructure human cognitive behavioral therapies.
And maybe that understanding, that deeper connection to ourselves, can help us build more resilient bodies and minds that can deal with all of this uncertainty. If we tie our physical health to our mental health, we can use our bodies as feedback mechanisms for understanding what's going on in our minds. It's about not just reacting to what's going on around us, but building a foundation that lets us be more resilient over the long haul.
Yeah, exactly. It's about finding ways to cultivate that inner peace and well-being, even in the midst of chaos. I really feel like it's both and. We need to keep ourselves and our communities healthy and also keep our systems accountable and humane. It's a never-ending process, I think.
Definitely. It's about taking all of this in and creating long-term solutions that benefit us all. And it helps to remember, even when the world feels like it's spinning, to keep moving forward, even if it's one step at a time.
Well, thank you for joining us on World Gone Weird today. Let's continue to explore and adapt to all that's going on, and remember to take care of each other and ourselves.